At first glance, Dusty looked like any other lost puppy mud-caked fur, quiet whimpers too thin for comfort. He slept by the fire, ate what he was given, and followed Ben from room to room like a shadow. But then Ben noticed the small things. Dusty never barked. He never chased toys or wagged his tail. And every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. he would sit in front of the window and begin to howl, not like a dog missing home, but like a wolf announcing its territory to the dark. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The rain hadn't let up since morning. Cedar Grove, a quiet tree-lined town nestled between the ridges of Oregon's western mountains, had a reputation for its endless drizzle, and that day was no different. Gray clouds blanketed the sky, hanging low over the rooftops, and dripping mist across the tall evergreens. The streets were half flooded with runoff water, and the scent of wet pine clung to the air like a second skin. It was late afternoon, and the streetlights flickered on prematurely, casting warm amber pools in the gloom. Ben Whitaker hunched forward in the driver's seat of his aging Subaru Outback, the wipers swishing in slow rhythm across the windshield. At 34, Ben had the kind of face that held quiet thought, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw softened by days-old stubble, and eyes that always seemed to scan just past the present moment. His brown hair was perpetually tousled, a natural match for someone who spent most of his time outdoors, photographing wildlife, or hiking through mist-shrouded forests. Solitude suited him not because he feared people, but because silence never asked anything of him. After losing his younger brother in a hiking accident 8 years ago, Ben had withdrawn from the noisy expectations of the world and taken refuge in the rhythms of nature. As he made the last turn before his gravel driveway, something shifted at the edge of his vision. A flicker of movement beneath a weather-beaten billboard that once advertised blueberry jam, but now served only as a bird perch. He eased the car to a halt. Rain splashed onto the gravel in chaotic patterns as he stepped out, pulling his waxed canvas jacket over his head like a makeshift umbrella. The cold sank instantly into his jeans, but Ben's focus was fixed on the figure half curled under the sign. At first glance, it looked like a pile of damp rags, but then it trembled. A faint whimper reached his ears, soft, unsure, almost apologetic. Ben crouched low, squinting through the veil of water, and saw the shape take form, a small canine, no older than a few months, its fur slick to the skin and shivering violently. The creature had the golden coat of a retriever, though muddied and matted with wet soil. Its eyes, however, weren't quite what Ben expected. They were sharper, more focused than a typical puppy's, alert and intelligent, with a glint of something ancient behind the fear. Still, it didn't back away. It watched him carefully as he whispered soothingly and slowly extended his hand. "Hey, little one. You lost out here." The pup sniffed, took a cautious step forward, then another, and finally collapsed into Ben's arms with a sigh of surrender. He wrapped it tightly in his jacket and hurried back to the car, heart beating faster than it should have. As he settled the pup on the passenger seat, it looked at him not with gratitude, not even fear, but with unreadable patience. Ben drove home in silence, the soft jazz he normally played for his indoor plants humming faintly in the background. The house, a 2-story timber cottage on the edge of Cedar Grove's forest line, welcomed him with the creak of old floorboards and the familiar smell of wet wood and lemon oil. He placed the pup on a thick towel in front of the stone fireplace and began gently rubbing its fur dry. "You're a mess, aren't you?" he murmured, smiling as the dog blinked up at him. "Dusty." "Yeah." "Dusty suits you." Dusty, so named for the grayish tinge of dirt still clinging to its coat, didn't respond with a tail wag or a whine. Instead, it curled into a tight ball and closed its eyes, letting out only the faintest exhale. Ben noticed again how its paws were slightly longer, and the ears, while floppy, had a strange angle to them, more wolfish than retriever. He made a quick dinner grilled cheese and soup, and left a small bowl of warm milk and shredded chicken beside the sleeping pup. Dusty awoke only when the scent touched its nose, and it devoured the meal with quiet precision. Not the frantic hunger of a starved dog, but the calculated pace of a wild animal conserving energy. While the rain continued outside, Ben sat in the armchair across the room camera on the coffee table, watching Dusty drift off to sleep again. He felt something stir in him, not quite worry, not quite awe. A question, perhaps, or the beginning of one. Next door, in a small white and blue farmhouse with a crooked mailbox and a front porch littered with chalk drawings, 11-year-old Lucy Harper was writing in her weathered journal. The lines were uneven, pressed with the weight of someone not quite used to keeping secrets but trying anyway. Her auburn hair was tied in a messy braid, freckles dusting her nose like cinnamon. She was a quiet girl, smart beyond her years, with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. Lucy lived with her grandmother since her father, a forest ranger named Thomas Harper, was stationed deep in the Cascades for weeks at a time. Tonight, Lucy had snuck out to the old garden shed at the back of their property. Inside, beneath a fleece blanket and tucked into a nesting box lined with leaves and moss, was a juvenile barred owl with a wounded wing. She had found it 2 days ago, lying on the roadside, and had been feeding it strips of raw meat while scribbling her observations like a scientist. She hadn't told her grandmother. The bird, who she secretly named Moth, blinked at her now with eyes as dark and deep as night. Day 3. Moth seems less scared. Ate 4 pieces of meat. Still no flight, wings stiff. Maybe fractured. She looked over her shoulder. The rain outside had begun to slow. Somewhere, not too far away, she thought she heard a soft howl. Morning and Cedar Grove arrived dressed in its usual gray. Fog rolled in from the hills, hugging the rooftops and softening the pine-lined streets like a watercolor left out in the rain. Ben Whitaker stood at the window of his kitchen, sipping coffee from a chipped mug with a faded owl printed on the side. His eyes drifted toward the fireplace where Dusty, still curled up on the same towel from the night before, lay motionless. The creature hadn't stirred once since Ben woke up, not even when the coffee grinder had grown to life. He watched as Dusty slowly lifted his head, blinking in the light, filtering through the rain-specked windows. There was no yawn, no playful stretch like a typical puppy. Instead, Dusty stood with deliberate precision, placed each paw as though testing the floor beneath him, then walked silently to the living room window. His golden coat caught the light just right, revealing a subtle pattern of darker markings along his spine, almost too symmetrical to be random. Ben reached for his camera instinctively. He'd begun documenting animals long before his grief made solitude necessary. Now it was more than a hobby. It was a habit, one that gave shape to his quiet hours. He snapped a few frames of Dusty watching the backyard, his head cocked slightly to the side ears, pricked not floppy, not perky, but something in between. Every inch of his stance radiated alertness. He didn't bark, he didn't wag, he simply stared. When Ben tried offering him a rubber chew toy later that morning, a brightly colored thing shaped like a squirrel, Dusty gave it a single sniff before turning his head away. Not disinterested. Dismissive. That reaction stayed with Ben. So did the claws. He'd noticed them more clearly when drying Dusty the night before, sharper than he'd expected, longer than what he remembered from his foster dog experiences years ago. They were dark, almost black, and clicked softly on the wooden floors when Dusty walked. Not just a little overgrown, something different. By noon, Ben was at his desk in the small office tucked behind the kitchen, hunched over his laptop. He navigated to a niche online forum he occasionally visited, Paws and Whispers, a digital watering hole for animal rescuers, wildlife trackers, and the occasional overzealous pet owner. He uploaded 3 photos and wrote a brief post titled "Stray Golden Retriever Odd Behavior" and features neat insight. He described the silence, the unnatural stillness, the alertness that bordered on predatory. He left out the more personal stuff, the unease, the way Dusty's eyes followed him without blinking. Within 15 minutes, responses began trickling in. Some suggested trauma. Others mentioned feral mixes. One user asked if Dusty had been scanned for a microchip. Another offered a more unusual idea. Some rare breeds have wild lineage. Maybe a wolf dog. Ben bookmarked that comment. Something about it felt too close. That same afternoon, Lucy Harper stood on the gravel path dividing her grandmother's garden from the overgrown backyard shed. She wore a faded denim jacket with unicorn patches stitched by her own hand jeans, too short at the ankle, and mismatched socks peeking from rain boots. A red notebook was clutched tight to her chest, the spine fraying from overuse. She had just finished feeding Moth a name she now said aloud as though the owl were a younger sibling. The bird, tucked inside an old dog crate padded with towels, had begun shifting its injured wing. Small progress. Lucy had drawn pictures in her notebook with scribbled lines tracking what she called wild expressions. Today, however, Lucy's curiosity was drifting elsewhere. Earlier that morning, she'd seen a man walking past their mailbox. He was tall, wore a canvas jacket with old hiking patches on the sleeves, and had something golden trotting beside him. At first, she thought it was a retriever until it turned and looked directly at her from across the fence. That moment hadn't felt like being noticed. It had felt like being examined. That gaze stayed with her. Now, as she made her way through the trees toward the side fence that bordered Ben's yard, Lucy couldn't resist the tug of that strange feeling. She crouched behind a bramble bush, notebook still in hand, and watched as Ben crouched near the animal in his backyard, tossing small treats that were studiously ignored. The creature sat near the porch steps, unmoving except for its ears, which twitched at every distant sound. Lucy pressed her hand to her mouth. It's not a dog, she thought. Not really. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice from the house. Her grandmother, Margaret Harper, was calling. Margaret, once a high school English teacher, was now 74, upright in posture and iron-voiced. She wore her white hair in a tight bun and believed in order rules and earning your voice through good grammar. Since Lucy's mother had passed 5 years ago in a car accident, Margaret had taken over guardianship with a strict blend of structure and stoicism. But even she had started to notice Lucy slipping into something quieter, more curious, more distant. Like the woods had started calling her too. Lucy turned and ran back toward the house, brushing dirt from her knees, as she went, already deciding she'd write down everything she saw in her notebook tonight about Moth, about the dog that wasn't a dog, and about how maybe the animals understood her in a way people didn't. That evening, Ben sat cross-legged on the floor of his living room, camera in his lap, staring at Dusty. The creature had returned to the window just as before. Same angle, same stare. Ben took out his phone and scrolled through the thread he'd started on the forum. The wolf dog theory was gaining traction. A new message caught his eye. If he's part wolf watch for pacing, staring at Exit's reluctance to play, they don't behave like pets. Ben looked up. Dusty was pacing. Quiet, measured strides from window to door, then back, again. He opened a new tab on his browser and typed how to identify wolf hybrids. And then, as if on cue, Dusty stopped, turned slowly, and looked him straight in the eyes. The wind had shifted by the time Ben loaded Dusty into the back seat of his car. The clouds had parted slightly, giving way to a weak shaft of morning light over Cedar Grove. The town's misty veil remained, but the rain had paused and everything shimmered with leftover dew. Ben had barely slept. Dusty's pacing and intermittent growls through the night kept jolting him awake. And at 3:12 a.m., a sound unlike anything Ben had ever heard had come echoing through the house, a low, drawn-out howl that rose and fell like some ancient morning song. Now, as he turned the key in the ignition, Dusty lay silent in the back seat, his head resting against the window, eyes alert but still. The dog, or whatever Dusty really was, hadn't made a single noise since sunrise. Ben checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing the deep circles under his eyes. He didn't want to overreact, but the signs were piling up, and it was time for a professional opinion. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town, a modest brick building with a cobalt blue awning and a painted wooden sign that read, Cedar Grove Animal Care. The interior was warm and smelled of antiseptic and cedar shavings. Behind the counter stood a woman in her mid-30s with chestnut curls pulled back into a high ponytail and wide shoulders that hinted at physical labor. She wore forest green scrubs, a gold pendant in the shape of a paw around her neck, and a welcoming expression that dimmed slightly as she looked at the chart in front of her. "Morning," she said with a tired smile. "You must be Ben Whitaker. And this is Dusty." Ben nodded. "He's complicated." The woman extended a hand. "I'm Tessa Monroe, vet tech, and I'm afraid Dr. Monroe, my sister Alicia, is out today. Emergency call upstate. She won't be back until the weekend." Ben sighed. "Of course, we're still offering basic services today, vaccinations, chip scans, wellness checks, but nothing too in-depth." She eyed Dusty, whose stillness didn't match his age. "You were hoping for something more." Advanced, Ben hesitated. "I was hoping someone could tell me if I brought home a wild animal." Tessa raised an eyebrow but didn't laugh. "I've seen stranger things. I'll note it in the file and let Alicia know you'll be rescheduling." With the visit postponed, Ben turned toward the door. As they left, Dusty glanced once over his shoulder, locking eyes with Tessa in a way that made her visibly stiffen. She didn't say anything, but Ben noticed her fingers tighten around the clipboard. Back in the car, Dusty appeared more relaxed. He even laid his head in Ben's lap during the drive home, a rare display of contact. Yet something about the creature's body remained, coiled, as if he were always seconds away from turning into something else. That night, the howling returned. Long, echoing wails that didn't belong in Cedar Grove. Ben wasn't the only one who noticed. 2 houses down, a retired mailman named Clark Dempsey stood on his porch in thermal pajamas, a flashlight in one hand and a mug of chamomile in the other. He was in his 60s with a weathered face, a white beard stained from coffee, and a tendency to over-communicate. By the next morning, half the block had heard his account of the ghost wolf howling near Ben's place. The forums were worse. Ben's thread had exploded overnight with speculation. Words like wolf-dog hybrid and even canid anomaly filled the replies. One user insisted that he contact wildlife control immediately. Another asked if Dusty's eyes changed color in moonlight. Ben read through them all, unsure what to believe. But not everyone was frightened. Lucy Harper crouched in her backyard, the glow of a headlamp bobbing slightly with her movement. She was feeding Moth again, minced rabbit from the butcher, this time when the sound of cracking twigs startled her. She froze. Out from behind the old compost bin stepped a man broad-shouldered and bearded, wearing a camouflage jacket and worn jeans. He held a hunting bow slung over his back and moved with a kind of practiced ease that immediately put Lucy on edge. "Hey there," he said, his voice gravelly. "Didn't mean to scare you." Lucy stepped back instinctively, shielding the open crate behind her. "You Harper's girl?" he asked. "Ranger Tom's kid." She didn't answer. The man shrugged. "Name's Rick. I rent the cabin up near Hollow Ridge. I was tracking a wounded buck down the trail, heard some rustling back here. Just checking it wasn't something bigger." Lucy's fingers curled tighter around her flashlight. This is private property." Rick raised his hands. "Just passing through. No trouble." Then Dusty arrived. The blur of golden fur exploded from between the bushes behind Lucy, snarling low and primal. He stood rigid in front of her ears, flattened fangs bared. Rick instinctively reached for his bow, but stopped when Dusty stepped forward. One step, then another. The growl deepened. Rick backed away slowly, muttering something under his breath. "That yours?" Lucy shook her head. Rick didn't ask twice. He disappeared into the dark. Dusty turned to Lucy. His expression softened. He didn't wag, he didn't bark, but he leaned forward and bumped his forehead lightly against her shoulder before retreating back through the fence gap. That night, Lucy wrote everything down in her notebook. "He's not just a dog," she scribbled underlined twice. "He saw the danger before I did. He wasn't scared. He was protecting me. And I think he knows who I am." She drew a sketch of Dusty, taller than most retrievers' eyes, like twin embers standing guard in the fog. Something had shifted. In the wild, you don't earn trust with commands. You earn it with silence. The air in Cedar Grove carried a different weight that morning. Not heavier, but clearer, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The fog had retreated to the treetops, and streaks of pale gold light fell through the fir branches like quiet revelations. Ben Whitaker stepped onto his porch with Dusty at his heel, the leash hanging loose between them more symbolic than necessary. Dusty didn't need direction. He moved with awareness like something born in the forest, and only briefly tolerating suburbia. Ben's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. The name on the screen, Dr. Alicia Monroe. "Morning." Her voice came clear and focused like the woman herself. "Heard you've got something strange for me." Ben smiled faintly. "That's one word for it. Bring him in. I've cleared my schedule." Dr. Alicia Monroe was tall and composed, the kind of woman who moved like her time mattered and her decisions were final. She wore dark jeans and a fitted navy coat over her scrubs, long braids twisted into a bun at the base of her neck. Her skin was warm brown, her eyes sharp behind slim-framed glasses. People in Cedar Grove sometimes called her aloof, but it wasn't arrogance. Alicia had seen things. Before moving to town 3 years ago, she had worked with endangered species and illegal animal trafficking in Costa Rica. A venomous snake bite to the thigh had forced her into retirement from field work, but not from truth. Ben sat nervously in the clinic's smaller exam room, while Dusty, calm but alert, lay on the mat beside the table. Alicia entered with a quiet step and an evaluating stare. "Let's take a look at the mystery guest." She knelt beside Dusty and offered her hand palm down. Dusty sniffed it briefly, then blinked slowly, non-threatening but not exactly friendly either. Alicia began a standard physical exam, palpating muscles, examining eyes and ears, checking paw pads and joints. Her touch was firm, practiced, but something shifted in her posture as she reached Dusty's jaw. She tilted his head gently and parted the lips to reveal the teeth. Her brow furrowed. "These aren't domestic," she murmured. "Carnassials are too developed. And the canines, this isn't a retriever's mouth." Ben leaned forward. "Then, what is he?" Alicia didn't answer immediately. She turned Dusty's forepaw gently, then stepped back and retrieved a digital tablet. Pulling up a series of reference photos, skulls, jaw structures. Comparative anatomy, she narrowed in on one image. "I've seen this once before," she said. "Years ago, during a smuggling case out of southern Mexico. Locals called them Lobo Dorado golden wolves. Not actual wolves, not exactly. A lost subspecies believed extinct. Genetically somewhere between Mexican gray wolf and retriever lineage. We thought the last confirmed one died in a conservation center in 1997. Ben stared at her. "You're saying Dusty's part, extinct part rediscovered," Alicia corrected, "which means someone bred one. Likely illegally. Trafficking in hybrids isn't new, but this one escaped or was dumped." Dusty looked at her ears, twitching as if understanding. "I need to report this," Alicia added, her voice softening. "But he's not dangerous. He's calm, responsive, intelligent. If he were born in the wild, he'd be unapproachable." Ben felt the weight settle in his chest, an answer finally, but not one that gave clarity. Instead, it gave responsibility. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Standing in the doorway was Lucy Harper, clutching her red notebook with both hands. Her braid was crooked today, her boots muddy from the shortcut she'd taken through the trees. "Hi," she said, breathless. Ben. Can I show you something?" Ben turned surprised but not unwelcoming. Alicia gestured toward the corner. "You're Lucy, right? Come in. But only if Dusty says it's okay." Lucy approached slowly and Dusty stood tail still. For a long moment he watched her silent. Then, with a deliberate motion, he took one step forward and pressed his forehead gently to her hand. Alicia raised her brows. Approval granted. Lucy opened her notebook and flipped to a page near the middle. A drawing of an owl, lopsided but recognizable, sat beside neat block letters. "This is Moth," she said. "I've been taking care of him. He broke his wing near the Ridge Road, and I've been hiding him in our shed." Ben blinked. "Lucy, I know it's not allowed," she said quickly. "But I needed someone to tell me if I should let him go." Alicia studied the page, then the girl. "If he's healing and regaining movement, he'll need the wild again soon. You've done more than most grown-ups would." Lucy looked down. "It's hard, letting go." Alicia nodded. "But it's also part of love. For Moth, for Dusty." Ben looked at the creature beside him, no longer a mystery, but still far from understood. Dusty was more than a dog. And if Alicia was right, he wasn't meant to stay here. But Dusty looked content, watching Lucy tail just slightly swaying. And something about the silence felt like peace. Cedar Grove woke that morning to a rare clarity. The fog had lifted completely, revealing the full stretch of the forest's green shoulders, and the sun spilled onto the town like a long-withheld truth. Birds called from rooftops and pine canopies alike, their voices sharp and sure in the cold spring air. It was the kind of day made for decisions, the kind where the horizon feels closer. Ben Whitaker loaded the back of his Subaru with a canvas duffel, a blanket, and a modest bag of Dusty's supplies, none of which the animal had shown much interest in, but Ben packed them anyway. Dusty stood nearby still as a stone, watching him, with the same unreadable gaze he'd worn since that first day under the billboard. But now there was something else in his eyes, too, awareness, as if he knew they were headed somewhere important. Inside the house, Lucy Harper was saying goodbye to Moth. The owl had recovered well over the past 2 weeks. His wing no longer dragged, and he'd begun making short experimental flights across the rafters of the old shed. Last night, he had circled once around Lucy's head and landed on the window frame. This morning, he was gone. Lucy stood in the doorway of the shed, notebook clutched to her chest, staring at the open sky. She didn't cry. Instead, she smiled in a quiet, knowing way, the way people smile when something wild has trusted them enough to leave. When she climbed into Ben's car, Dusty shifted to make room, resting his head briefly against her knee. She let her fingers run through his fur, feeling the deep warmth there. "Ready?" Ben asked. Lucy nodded. So is he. The drive to Cascade Ridge National Preserve took 2 hours of winding roads and steep ascents through dense, old-growth forest. Sunlight flickered between tree trunks like strobe lights, and patches of snow still clung stubbornly to the north-facing slopes. Ben hadn't been to the preserve in years, not since his brother's accident on one of the side trails. The place had once been their shared refuge. Now it felt like coming full circle. Waiting at the entrance was Thomas Harper, Lucy's father. Thomas was a tall man in his early 40s with a frame built for mountain work, broad shoulders, weathered hands, a square jaw half covered in ginger stubble. His uniform olive green jacket, cargo pants, and steel-toed boots was smudged with pine sap and trail dust. A faint scar ran from his right cheekbone to his temple, earned years ago when he was caught between a poacher and a frightened lynx. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. "Hey, Luce," he said, his voice low and gentle as he embraced his daughter. Then, eyeing Dusty, "So that's him." Dusty didn't growl. He didn't flinch. He simply met Thomas's gaze and blinked once, slow and steady. Thomas turned to Ben. "I got your message. We'll head to the research station. Some of the biologists are waiting." The research station was nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering firs and protected by low wooden fencing. 2 cabins, one for equipment, one for observation, sat at the edge of a lake that reflected the sky like polished silver. A woman in a field vest was already outside flipping through a binder and muttering to herself. Dr. Lena Corwin was a wildlife biologist in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair, hiking boots caked in red mud, and a voice like gravel rolled through stream water. She'd spent most of her life tracking wolf populations across the continent and had recently returned to Oregon to lead a hybrid genetics study at Cascade Ridge. Her reputation was one of scientific brilliance tempered by impatience. "Ben Whitaker," she said, without looking up. "This is the animal." Ben nodded. "His name's Dusty." Lena knelt and examined Dusty from a short distance. She didn't reach out, she observed. After a moment, she stood. "This isn't a domestic mix," she said, eyes narrowing. "You understand what this is." Ben gestured for Lucy to hand over a printout from Dr. Alicia Monroe's findings. Lena scanned at, her jaw tightening. "Alicia was right," she murmured. "This is Canis lupus aureum golden lobo, thought extinct. If this one escaped a smuggling operation, then we may have a link to something far bigger." Thomas stepped closer. "What are his options?" Lena exhaled. "Ideally, he'd be monitored in a semi-wild environment, low human interaction, high security, no breeding. But..." She looked at Dusty, who had positioned himself between Ben and Lucy as if instinctively guarding them. "I don't think he wants that." Ben's voice was quiet. "He hasn't wanted to leave since I found him. He stays close like he's choosing it, choosing us." Lena studied Dusty for a long time. "Well, in rare cases, she began some hybrid species are allowed to be housed under conditional wildlife stewardship, with restricted movement, public education responsibilities, and frequent vet reporting." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking of deputizing him." Lena smirked. "I'm thinking of watching, learning, and yes, making him part of something useful." Ben glanced at Lucy, who nodded encouragingly. "I'm willing," Ben said, "if he is." Dusty tilted his head, then sat calmly at Ben's side. Answer enough. That evening, they sat at the edge of the clearing just beyond the lake. Dusty lay stretched across the mossy ground, his fur catching the last golden streaks of light. Lucy sat beside him, sketching again. This time, not an owl, not a hybrid, just Dusty exactly as he was. Above them, a shape moved through the sky, broad wings silent as shadow. Moth circling once before disappearing into the forest. Lucy smiled. Dusty lifted his head and watched the owl vanish into the wild, then settled back down, touching his nose to the toe of her boot. Home, it seemed, wasn't just where you came from. It was also who stayed with you when you got there. Sometimes the ones who seem the most lost are the ones God places in our path for a reason. Dusty wasn't just a rare animal, He was a reminder that even the wildest hearts can find a home, and that love, when freely given, has the power to heal what the world has forgotten. In a world full of noise, it is often the silent, faithful presence beside us that speaks the loudest. Just like Dusty chose to stay, sometimes miracles don't come with thunder. They come in golden fur, quiet eyes, and a loyalty that feels like grace. Maybe you've felt like Dusty, misunderstood, misplaced, or even discarded. Or maybe you've been like Ben or Lucy, willing to care for something the world said wasn't worth saving. Whichever path you walk, remember God often works through small acts of kindness, through those who choose compassion over fear, and through bonds no one can explain, but everyone can feel. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder of hope. Leave a comment below, telling us your favorite moment, and if you believe in the power of love and divine timing, type Amen in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and help us spread more stories that remind the world miracles are real, and sometimes they walk beside us on 4 legs. May God bless you and everyone who is watching.